am from I also am from a place called Navajo Mountain, which is east of Page. Um, and that's where my maternal side is from. And so that's how I identify myself as Navajo male being on this earth. And I also have a background in education of Bachelor of Science in biology from Diné College, so I'm an alumni there. I also have a garden that I have been working on for the past, I would say 6 years, but more or so in the last 4 years, and so I have a lot of knowledge in that area. I also have livestock as well. Mostly sheep is what we're currently having, or what we currently have. But before we used to have horses, and goats, and we also have some chickens. So I kind of use all that within our little garden too, and we'll talk about that in here on how that can be used as well. So if you guys have any questions related to small scale gardening or even a large field, feel free to chime in. With that, I think we will go on with the presentation.
Where are you going?
I'm not waiting for you guys.
Where are you going?
Look around.
For what?
Hold up. Someone needs to be muted. Let me check. Okay. Before we get started, Lyrica, do you want to give yourself a quick introduction?
Yeah, I wasn't planning on, but I can. Junko Rebel Teki, Win B Lidika. I don't have much to say. Daryl and Jaden are really the stars of this workshop. Again, I'm with Uplift. I'm located on Tiwa territory in New Mexico. I'm really excited to learn. I got a little community plot here in so-called Albuquerque. So hoping to implement some of these teachings today. But again, if you have any questions about Uplift, feel free to message me, or if you have any tech issues, feel free to message me as well.
Okay, great. So moving on with the presentation, I just wanted to go over food sovereignty and what that is really fast, because I feel like when it comes to growing your own food and having a garden, it really has to come from a place of, wanting that reciprocal relationship with the earth. And so in Indigenous communities, we're under what's called food apartheid. So that's a systemic and structural, basically destruction of our foodways and our food systems. So being able to grow our own food is a way that we can restore our ancestral agricultural practices and also life ways. So food sovereignty, specifically Indigenous food sovereignty movements, are politically tied to space and place, and were developed as a part of the struggles against exploitation and colonization of place. Indigenous self-determination and autonomy is correlated with Indigenous food sovereignty and refers to the collective power of choice and the conversation about the autonomy of stateless nations and non-state collectivities. As well, Indigenous food sovereignty is much more than just a right to control the production and consumption of food, and is much more than just an agricultural practice. Indigenous peoples engaged in their food systems are not just farmers, but they are hunters, gatherers, fishers, shepherds, harvesting in and on the water and tending to the forest as well as to the fields.
Okay, so I think one of the things that is really important when it comes to gardening, especially if you're in a rural area, is to really pay attention to your climate area. And with us being here in the sub-arid desert regions, in Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Utah, and sometimes in Colorado, you really get into those sub-arid type of conditions. And so I think with pre-planning, I get if you're like beginning, it's really important to know what type of climatic conditions are around you. So that way you can use those details to kind of key in your type of vegetation that you're planning to grow. And then not only that, but also you can include that information on finding out what seed sources work best for you. Um, because a lot of times, people really look for seeds, but it's not seeds that are necessarily for their region. So really doing some of your research into the microclimates that are within your area or surrounding areas. So pick plants that are well adapted to your local climate. Keep in mind that drought tolerance, wind tolerance, sun, etc., is really a key factor into those. If you're in a region where it's really windy, you want something that's going to do good in that. If you have, in a region where it gets less rain, then you want something that's really drought tolerant, but doesn't need a lot of like water assistance kind of thing. And then a lot of the plants that you'll be growing too are going to need a certain amount of sunlight, some more than others. So just keeping in contact information on that. Kind of what time frame like the sun hits that ground to where it ends in the daytime. So that'll give you a key difference or key information about, what the amount of time you have in that little plot or section that you're planning to grow in. Use rainwater to water plants if possible, and that's where rainwater catchment really does help. But if not, whatever water source that you have, that's also one of the things we'll cover shortly. Plant during rainy seasons, and I think that's kind of the goal. We as far as agriculture goes, I think it's trying to plant near that time frame of the monsoon season, so that way our water hauling and water carrying and water watering in general really gets to be declined because it help you get help from the sky and such. And then Southwest predicted to experience some of the most drastic temperature increase and declines in precipitation, especially during this time of climate change and more drought tolerant or more drought starts to happen. So looking into those time frames really helps. And then I think one thing to really consider is just to kind of write into your little planners, if you have one, I think would be really great in documenting what happens during a certain time frame. Or you can just have a planner and be like, oh, like my plants died during this time, or something ate it during this time, or like it rained really bad here and flooding happened. So, and then next year, when you plan to redo it again, hopefully that you don't get discouraged. You'll look back on those little notes that you had taken the previous year, and that'll kind of give you a generalized guideline on what to do for the next year.
And just to talk a little bit more, I think in the face of climate change, it becomes even more important to start planting and regreening the landscape, especially because there's a lot of desertification happening. The drought is getting worse. So this is one way that we can actually mitigate climate change by planting plants and planting not only crops that you plant every year, but also perennials, trees, bushes, native plants in your landscape.
Yep.
Because this will actually create, this will make it so your landscape actually rains more. So through the transpiration of your plants. So it's a great way to actually do something about climate change in your area.
Yes. And not only that, I think if you're creating a micro scale of conditions around wherever you are, even if it's not for eating, like if you're just growing more of the native shrubs and native grasses and native trees in the region, that really shifts microscopically, because a lot of that really goes back to the soil. And that's another thing too, really look at your soil, know if it's clay, sand, or loam, or silt. And then a lot of times that'll be an indication of what type of plants you're able to grow in it, or it'll give you an idea on what to do about it. Because if it's more clay, then you need to add more organic material so that it'll actually absorb water instead of it just hitting that hard surface and then running off of it, and so stuff like that. And then going back to what I was saying about microscopic level, a lot of the microbiology happens in the soil, And so once you get that rhythm going, it'll start to, attract more things as far as like bigger insects, bigger bugs. And then once you get to that point, you start to attract the birds that'll start to eat on the bugs. And so you'll have this kind of like a ecosystem that you'll create. And then from there, it'll get to bigger predators and then bigger bird of prey. And then you have larger mammals involved. And so you're creating this whole system in the little space that you have created. And so that it really makes a big change on a small scale. So just starting it, I think it's really important.
And I wanted to talk a little bit about composting before we start talking about soil, because
Mhm.
I feel like this is something that's great that anybody can start doing. And basically composting is taking green materials and brown organic materials and sort of creating this food for your soil. And what you can do is, so you can get green organic materials, and these include grass clippings, food scraps, manure, and these contain large amounts of nitrogen. And then your brown organic materials, which include dry leaves, wood chips, branches, straw, cardboard, paper, napkins, things like that. They contain large amounts of carbon and little nitrogen. And what this does is it creates an environment for microorganisms to go in there and to break this stuff down, and it creates a very, very good amendment for your soil, and also just a really good for your plants to take in more nutrients. And the common ratio of brown and green material is usually 2 parts brown material to 1 part green material. Also, you want to keep in mind your moisture content for your compost. Usually a compost bin, you can create it really inexpensively. Here I have my example, which is just using 4 pallets, and I just wired them together. You can also create a compost bin using fencing material and chicken wire, just creating, you usually want it to be 3 by 3 cubic feet. And you can also even just make a pile and have a freestanding pile, but that might take longer than these other methods. Back to moisture content, it's good to keep your compost moist. It should be as wet as a wringed out sponge. You shouldn't be able to squish it and get any water content out, but it shouldn't be dry to the touch. You also want good oxygen flow. The microorganisms that are decomposing these materials in your pile require oxygen. So aerating the pile by turning it with a pitchfork or with a shovel is a great idea. Also, that's why pallets are a good idea, because they have slats on the side. They aren't completely, closed in on all sides. So that also allows additional airflow through your pile. Also, having some bulkier items such as wood chips and straw, which allows oxygen to go into your pile as well. Also, your temperature is really important. One of the things that I find is really important for having a pile is to get a temperature gauge that's specifically for compost. So it's just a big rod that you can stick into your pile that reaches the middle, and it'll tell you the temperature of your compost pile. Because microorganisms require a certain temperature range for optimal activity, and certain temperatures promote rapid composting, and they also destroy pathogens and weed seeds that could be in your compost. And the temperature of your pile should be at least 140 degrees, but not above 160 degrees. Once it goes above 160 degrees, you'll be killing a lot of the microorganisms that are important for composting your pile. And this method can actually take probably a month to a year. So depending on how much you're turning your pile and how much you're adding water to it, depends on how fast it would be ready. Daryl, do you have anything to add?
No, I think you covered about all the basics, but just making sure that you have your browns, your greens, your moisture, and your aeration. Having those four things are the key points. And then once you add everything together, just making sure that every layer, about maybe 6 inches, depending on how much stuff you're adding together, that you soak it pretty well. The moisture level is what really makes a difference because the oxygen flow is actually for the microorganisms that are called aerobic bacteria, which are the ones who are breaking down the organic material into, microscopic type of nutrients for the plants and stuff like that. And then once you, if you don't, if you don't aerate your, or like, turn over your piles, that's where you start to get to anaerobic type of bacteria, which don't need oxygen. And that's where I guess some of the bad bacteria start to come into play. And that's where you could introduce that into your soil, which you don't want. So you want to make sure that you keep your good bacteria alive. So that's where the churning comes into play. But also they love to be in an environment that's moist, not drenching, but just enough to, keep alive. So just those key factors are in there. But other than that, once you start it, keep going. If you want a faster result, do the churning weekly, but it's recommended at least once a month. Okay, so now we're going to be going into soil, and soil is really great, but there's a lot of factors to it. But when you're beginning, you don't really, put in that to factor into thinking about it. Later on is when you really start to, get the gist of it. But living layer of nutrients comprised of earth, microorganisms, organic material, minerals, insects, etc. Adding organic material or matter like compost, aged manure, meaning like manure that was taken from your corral and putting into an area where it can be exposed to sun, but away from the corral to where, new manure doesn't get mixed in again. So having that aged manure means it's been drying for at least more than a year. For safety precautions, I think it would be best to do it longer, to at least 2 to 3 years, because a lot of manure has a lot of parasitic eggs that are still in there that can survive drought, like tenfold. There's actually some bacteria that they excrete too that are, part of the natural system, but it's not good for us to consume. There's also some what do you call it, some insects in there too that that try to eat the manure and stuff like that, so that's their natural biome. So making sure that all that, and then like I was saying, if you want to get rid of any type of bacteria, take away the moisture, take away the nutrients from it, and then that's where you start to like really kill off a lot of the bacteria. And so I guess this is a reverse composting type of thing. So you're taking away the moisture to get rid of the bacteria. So that's how aged manure works. And then mulch. Mulching is a really beneficial type of implement that we can add into our gardens because that really protects the top layer of our soil from evaporating all of the water that we had just put into it. So it helps retain moisture, protects the composition of the soil, microorganisms feed, and it feeds the soil. It helps to prevent weeds. That's also another good benefit of mulching. So you can do mulching with straw hay, making sure that you know your sources of that hay though, because some companies do use pesticides to control, a lot of things on their growing area. So making sure you know your sources as well. Pine needles, the brown ones, not the green ones, because if you add the green ones onto your beds, a lot of pine needles are really high in acidity, so it can turn your soil acidic, and so a lot of plants don't like that. But if you want to grow flowers or anything like that, um, um, acidic soil is really great for them. So you can use that for flowers. Um, so making sure that you get the brown pine needles and making sure that it's been sitting for a while too, to get rid of all the acid in it. And then once you get to that point of comfortable state, then you can add them all as mulch. And it also works well in really high windy regions. You can put it in a pile, and its little structure of intertwining into one another actually holds together the pile. But also if the wind comes through, it'll just like blow between it. It doesn't blow them away, it'll blow between them. So that's the way to kind of mitigate mulching in the high wind area. Okay, leaves for vegetable gardens. So leaves is really great for mulching because all that breaks down, and that's nutrients more for your soil slowly. Perennials and shrubs like wood chips and bark. So just keep in mind that wood chips work great for only woody type of plants. So your bushes, your shrubs, your trees, your orchards, your forbs, some of them are kind of woody. So the wood type of mulch is good for that. If you start to add that into your vegetable garden, it'll start to break down, but that's the breakdown process also uses nutrients that the plant will also take up too. So instead of the plant taking up that nutrient, like nitrogen, that process of the nitrogen will go towards the breakdown process of the wood chips. So you're making sure that woody type of plants love woody type of mulching. Like I said, the straw, the leaves, if you have grass clippings, that works great too. And the pine needles work great for your gardens. I would prefer that best. So yeah, so that's just a note on that part. And then making sure that you know your soil. So if it's really sandy, that means that the water is just gonna drain. And so what you want to add into that is organic material to help absorb water a little bit more, but keeping it drenched a little bit more. And then vice versa, if you have clay, you add more organic materials too to that to help hold moisture instead of just having it pan on top of the surface and then running over. So did you want me to cover this one?
Yeah,
Okay,
go for
cool.
it.
So, and this, I love to do these, especially if you're a beginner, especially with the mason jar method type of soil determination is what I would call it. And there's one way that you could do it if you don't have a jar, which is the ribbon test. And then there's the other one with the mason jar. So for the ribbon test, you're just gonna get a handful of soil, and then you're gonna wet it to until it's moist, not like like really dripping in the water. You're gonna damp it really good, basically, and then you're gonna kind of get it between your index finger and your thumb, and then your thumb's gonna be rolling forward, not like a whole bunch of pressure, but just enough to where you get nice consistency of a soil going forward, and then from there, you're just gonna keep pushing forward like this. And then if you have one that starts to break off instantly, that means that you have sandy soil. But if you keep going and you create like about a few inches of length of that soil that you have been squeezing through your fingers, and it breaks finally, then that means you have silty type of soil, meaning it's like part sand, part clay, in between type of thing. And then if you keep going and you use all the soil that's in between your fingers, and it creates this nice like ribbon or curve to it, and it didn't break, that means you have clay soil. So that's just a really and then you get to feel the differences. So you get to feel the difference of sand, silt, and then clay. So I would suggest if you know where each of them are at, give it a try, and you'll get to feel it on your own. The sand's more grainy. The silt is more like slippery, kind of like soft. The clay is soft, but it's sticky. So that's the different textures that you could do. That's texture wise. And then if you really want to get into the I guess details of the percentages out of 100 of like what sand, silt, and clay are in your sand, then you can get an empty mason jar. Make sure that nothing patterns on them. Something that's all clear all the way around, so you can see through it. And then you're gonna fill half of that mason jar with sand or your soil that you're wanting to test, and then fill the rest of it with water. And you make sure that it soaks all the way down into the soil that you're doing. You'll see bubbles come out, and then the water will start to go down, and then you want to fill it up all the way just about an inch or two below the rim line. or like an inch below the rim line. Yeah. And so you'll have an air pocket. And then once you get to that point, you're gonna close the lid and you're gonna revert it or shake it vigorously, making sure that you take out most of the rocks that are in that or large twigs like that. So you removing those, but keeping note that that's what you removed. And then you're gonna really shake it really good. Up until you notice that there's no clumps in there or anything like that. So you're just gonna keep doing that for like at least, I would say 2 minutes. And then once you have that, you're gonna look for a flat surface, place the jar, perfectly down, and just wait for about maybe 30 minutes to an hour. Recommended at least 24 hours because that's when everything settles, with gravity. And then I don't know if you guys know this, but there's different particle weights to soil, sand, silt, and clay. But with the larger particles, is going to be setting at the bottom, so that's going to be sand. The medium-sized particles are going to be the one that are going to be called silt, and that's going to be the mid layer with a little bit of grain in between that layer and the clay. And the clay will be the last one to kind of settle on top because that's the lightest, most microscopic type of soil that you will ever see, or you won't get to see actually unless you have a microscope. But anyways, if you notice that in the water it's really cloudy, that means it's not done. So once you set it down, you're not going to move it again until you actually have everything settled. So that's why it's recommended to at least have it sitting for at least 24 hours. And then after that, once you can see through the water, that's when you know everything has settled. And then, so whatever layers that you're going to see, from the top of that to the bottom of the jar, you're gonna draw a line. That's gonna equal out to your 100%. And then for those each layers of the sand and silt and clay separations, you're gonna draw another line. And then out of those each sections, you're gonna determine out of 100 how much percentage is, how much percentage is sand, how much percentage is silt, and then how much percentage is clay. So as you can see on the little diagram example, the sand jar on the left side is going to be 0 to 10% clay. The silt is going to be 0 to 10% silt. And then it's going to be 80 to 100% type of sand. So in that diagram, there's another chart that I should have included in here, but based on that, that means you have sandy soil, basically. And then in the middle is going to be 10 to 30% clay, 30 to 50% clay, or what do you call it, silt, and then 25 to 50% sand. And so if you have that generalized percentages for each of the sections, then you start to get into the loamy area, which is a kind of a perfect type of mixture of the particles of sand, silt, and clay. And that's what you want generally. But if you don't, no biggie, you can work on it. But that's like the perfect type of soil that you want. And then clay is just vice versa of sand. You're gonna have more clay than you have of silt and sand, and so you have really clay soil. So hopefully that's a good explanation. If not, feel free to contact me or Jaden about it, and we'll do something to help you out with that. Awesome. And then if there's no questions, hold on.
We have a few questions in the chat. The first question says, what happens if you just use tap water to water your plants if you don't have rainwater? I can add something about this. There is a farm near Gallup that used just their tap water to water their plants, and they notice you have to know where your tap water is coming from and how they treat the water, because they were watering their plants using Gallup City water for a few years, and they noticed that their plants were getting smaller every year. And so what was happening was there was a lot of salt in the tap water, and so that was introducing more salt into the soil and actually making it so the plants grew smaller every year. So now they just use harvested rainwater. So I think it's important to know where your tap water comes from.
Yeah, it is. A lot of times if you're in a city or in a small community that has running water, they don't always all use the same type of system. So you have to really research that on your end. Sometimes you can go online, find that information, or whoever your landlord or your, person that you pay should know that information as well. And if not, make a big deal about it because, it's important for you as well if you're consuming that water. So yeah, tap water is great, but not consistently. So if you're just using it from April to September, and then using the rainwater from, the sky or whatever catchment system you have for the rest of the year, that would be great too to implement. Yeah, so it just really depends on how much information you want to look into it. But I would suggest to really look into your water sources, and then see if you can haul water too nearby. I don't know. I'm pretty sure there's some wells nearby, but also that too. Know the water source of that too. So yeah, hopefully that helped.
There is one more question, and it says, are there any specific plants that need nitrogen, manure, etc., or is compost good for all plants? Hopefully that makes sense. Usually, if you look on your seed packet or wherever you got your seeds, they'll tell you if your seed likes rich compost. And I know like melons, like watermelons and like cantaloupes, they like a lot of compost.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and then all plants love nitrogen. Um, Manure is just an alternative point of of type of nutrients that is natural that comes from animals, but then there's a lot of underlying conditions with that too. So that's where I say it's best to have manure for that if you're going to be implementing it into your garden. But if you know of a company that does manure with for composting, I'm pretty sure they have it down, so it would be safe for that to use in your garden. And then there's different types of compost. There's mushroom compost, there's vegetable compost, there's manure compost from different types of animals. There's you can, like Jaden was explaining earlier, you can create your own compost from your garden or from your kitchen. So for me, I use all of my kitchen scraps to be put back into the garden, and that over time breaks down, and then that can be used as your own compost that you created at home. It's just going to take some time, but it's locally sourced. You did it on yourself, by yourself. So it's pretty great. So hopefully that helps. But compost in general is great to use.
Yeah, it is. And like Daryl was saying, being able to utilize your kitchen scraps is also a great way to keep those out of the landfill. Because most of the time, your kitchen scraps, if you're just putting them into your garbage can, they're getting wasted by going into a landfill. So if you want to keep them out of the landfill and to actually utilize that to kind of, I don't know, reduce your waste, then that's a great way.
Yeah.
So just going over seeds now, you want to choose a seed that is well adapted to the area you're planting, keeping in mind water availability and need, and also your sun exposure. So some seeds like full sun. So they'll want, the full day, the full range of sun that they can get. These are a lot of the time like your peppers, because the hotter it is in your area, the hotter your pepper will be. And also some plants are shade tolerant, or they even like the shade. So these plants you want to plant in the shade of things like corn or like trees. Different plants will require different elements. So just making sure that you plant accordingly. Also, you want to keep in mind your germination time. Plants like peppers are going to take a long time to germinate. I planted my peppers probably like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and there's probably one that's germinated so far. So just be patient with that, and also starting them earlier in the season so that they have more time to grow. And then the plants that you also want to look at your seed packet to see which plants you should start indoors and transplant outdoors. And also what plants you should start outdoors, like your melon, squash, corn, and beans. Just to go over some seed starting steps, you want to develop a seed starting schedule ahead of time. This will provide a guideline so you know when to start your seeds. Seedlings need a lot of light, so you want to start them near either a big window that gets a lot of light in a greenhouse, or you can get supplemental grow lights. You also want to look into your growing containers. There's a lot of different things you can use for your growing containers. You just need to make sure that they have holes in the bottom so that they can properly drain their soil. These can be peat pots, toilet paper rolls. You can use newspaper, plastic containers, and then you want to place them into a leak-proof tray. And a lot of the times you need to start your seeds with a seed starting mix. You can make your own mix, but it's also, it's not very good to start your seeds with just your garden soil. So if you're going to make a seed mix, you want to make sure it's like parts garden soil, parts compost, and parts different materials, because you can also introduce like diseases and different bacteria into your seed starting mix, and you really want your seedlings to have a really great start. For me, I purchased my seed starting mix, just an organic seed starting mix from a local nursery, and this will ensure that you have healthy seedlings. You want to check the seed packet instructions to see how deep to sow your seeds. And then you want to poke holes into the soil in the center of your containers and sprinkle about 2 or 3 seeds. Cover the seeds with soil and mist the soil surface with water, and label the containers with the seed variety and sowing date. You also want to make sure you pre-moisten your soil, your seed starting mix, before you put them into your containers. You want to place your seedling trays in a warm location. You can also get a heating pad online. This could help you to just make sure that they're staying warm. And also, once your plants get to about a few inches tall, you want to start thinning your plants. You want to pick the biggest one that is usually the strongest, and then you want to get rid of the other ones by either cutting them. Sometimes you can separate them, but a lot of the times I just find it easier to cut the smaller ones. And then several weeks before transplanting outdoors to your outdoor garden, you want to harden off your seedlings to the outdoors. So you can do this by either getting a fan that will blow air onto your plants, so it kind of creates wind, so that the stems become stronger, or you can place them outside for like several hours a day. Yeah, anything else you want to add, Daryl?
So I think what Jaden was saying about, making sure that you know where your soil is from, so that way you can protect a lot of your seeds. If you notice, a lot of these seeds are going to be really small to where you can't pick them up individually. So that's where I guess planting a lot in one spot will happen a lot, and that's where you can eventually thin out after they start to get around 4 to 5 6 inches long. And then just remembering that the roots are growing below it too at the same time. So if you're going to be seed starting in seed start trays, that you're going to have to increase your trays after you start to see the roots coming out the bottom. If not, then that's where you start to get root bound, or you start to restrict the root access to nutrients. But that's also an indication that a lot of the nutrients that are in the soil that you had started it in has been depleted. And so the plant itself is looking for additional nutrients. So it's trying to spread out. So that's where, putting it in bigger pots or bigger containers before transplanting into the ground is really helpful. And then planning out the dates of when you're going to be planting. And usually you can cheat, I guess I would say cheat, because you're starting the seeds before it gets really warm outside. And that's where greenhouses really help in playing with that, or artificial light. And, the heat pad is where you can really utilize that into, kickstarting your season off. And that gives you about 2 to 4 weeks in advance, depending on the germination of the seed. And that's also a way to cheat, the germination rate of the plant too. So giving it the right conditions of warm soil and really fertile soil and really moist soil. But making sure that you don't water a lot, just dependent on the type of plant that you're going to start growing. And then greenhouses work really well, or hoop houses too, for that. But then making sure that once you're taken out of that climatic perfect climate condition, that you have it at least in a state where it's similar to where you'll be transplanting outside into the ground about a week before you plan to do that. So making sure there's that window of climatic conditioning that you're putting to the plant, and that's what you call hardening off. So just before you put it directly into the ground, make sure you have that hard off set, so that the plant will be like, oh, okay, like the perfect conditions are gone. I'm gonna be put into this other environment that's less, humidified or less warm. But you'll still be giving it water. So that's kind of the phase that it goes through before it goes into the ground directly. So just making sure you keep track of that. And then let me see what else is there. So yeah, so have fun with it basically. And you're not always going to be successful. You're going to be going through trials of failure, I guess. I definitely have and still am. So yeah. Okay, so now we're going to go into the area of, pick seeds that will do well in your region. So native seeds is really great, meaning that it's seeds that are from your area, from your zone, from an area that's close to your zone, even works best too. So that's where I guess a lot of your sources are going to be really researched into, the drought tolerant ones, the heat tolerant and cold tolerant. And then there is a difference between cool season, warm season type of plants too. So looking into those, and that'll also help you determine when to plant your seeds too. At the end of the spring season where it starts to get cool but it's kind of warm, or if it's directly in the heat of summer, or towards the end of end of summer, early fall. That's also another season of cool season. So that's how you can plan out your seeding areas too. And then we go into this area of zone planting, I believe is what it says, or zone map. So this is just a generalized information offered by USDA, just giving a generalized zone hardiness for the whole country of the USA, and Alaska and Hawaii and Puerto Rico. So if you look at the different zones, the different colors, I don't know where you guys are all at in this whole picture, but if we're looking at Arizona, our section is mostly in the light green, yellow green, and bluish area. That's where we're from, or I'm from. So that's gonna be generally around the, can't see that, 17B. Anyways, there's a lot of numbers that are gonna be in that. But once you determine that information, you will start to really understand the type of zones that your other seed sources might come from. And if they're similar or the same, then that would be a great source to use. But a lot of times I would say if you're going to be seed sourcing, go with the local farmer, go with the local business that's around your region, because a lot of those seeds are grown in the same area. And so they're great for your zones. Okay, so now we're going to be going to, and this goes back into planning ahead. So plan your calendar so you know what we'll be planting based on the first and last frost date. Last and first frost date are really important and crucial into your planning process, especially in gardening, because that gives you a time frame of when you can grow, and then how many days that whole thing is going to be from the first and last frost date. So the days in between that are going to be kind of like your generalized information of how many days you have before the first frost date comes up again at the end of the year. So once you find out that number, that number can be used into finding out other seeds that need a longer growing season, such as corn. A lot of corn needs about 185 days until it can actually produce a ear corn and fully mature. Um, so with that information, you'll find out a corn species that'll be within that time frame. But once you get into that first frost date at the end of the year, you're done with the warm season type of growing, and then you start to go into cool season. So like for instance, the average frost date for Flagstaff, the last frost date is going to be in June 9th. And then wait, yeah. And then the first frost date of the year again is going to continue in, let's see, when is that? November 22nd or October. Is that October?
For Flagstaff, it's September 22nd.
Oh, September. Okay. September 22nd. And then Phoenix, of course, it's Phoenix. So their ideal area of the first and last frost date are gonna vary much different from the higher elevation areas. So theirs is actually January 30th. Oh, so lucky. And then their first I guess frost date of the year is gonna be December 16th. And then so they have a really good growing season. Wow. Anyways, Albuquerque is gonna be April 16th, and then the first is gonna be October 28th. So slightly little longer than ours, but it's just gonna vary dependent on your region that you're gonna find information about. So just by those two information, you can really find out a lot about your growing season. So once you have that down and you find the seed sources that are related to that, then you can use that information going forth.
And if you want to know more about what your specific zone is, you can just go into Google and put whatever town or city you live in and then put in zone. That's what I did for my zone. I just put in Fort Defiance zone or hardiness zone, and it brought up 5B. So now I know when I look on like a seed packet, it'll say, okay, 5B zone, good to plant like in May or good to plant in April, things like that. So I kind of go off of that generally. Okay, so we're gonna go over some different different outdoor growing techniques. One of them is raised bed gardening. This is a great way to get started if you're like starting in your backyard, or if you want to start, above ground because I don't know, you have like prairie dogs or something. And it's also a great way to have more control over the medium of your soil. So if you have really like clay soil or if you have really sandy soil, you can actually grow in raised beds and it'll be a few feet off the ground. So you have more control over what the medium is in that raised bed. And there's different ways you can do raised bed growing. You can use pallets. You can use like recycled woods. The picture that we have on the bottom right corner, that's actually using these like corner connectors that are probably $4 at Home Depot, and you can get those really inexpensively, and then you just buy the wood planks and then you can put them up really easily, really fast without having to like screw in any boards or anything like that. You can also use like containers that are already made. So if you have like galvanized steel, like water holders for like your animals, you can use those. You can also use like containers. There's a lot of different options that you can. Let me mute some people. Okay. And then this is also a great way to introduce the no-till method. The no-till method is where you don't till your soil. So I feel like a lot of times conventional farming, they use a lot of tilling every year, going over with like big tillers or even like a smaller rototiller. is something that has been done for a long time. And it's actually not as good as you would think. I think the only time that I would till my soil is if it's super compacted. But other than that, you really don't need to be tilling your soil. So you're actually messing up the microorganisms and the ecology of the soil by tilling it. So what you want to do is actually just amend your soil with like compost or fertilizer, like manure, instead of tilling. And one of the ways that you can use the no-till method with a raised bed is by doing lasagna layering. So this is basically where you have different layers of like your browns and your greens. So the picture on the bottom is actually one of my raised beds that I did really inexpensively, which is some wood we had laying around the farm. And I put down a cardboard first to kind of have that layer between the natural soil and what I was going to be filling up the bed with. And then I added some branches and twigs with the green leaves on it. And then on top of this, I added straw, and then adding some more green stuff, so like manure, and then adding like more straw or dried leaves or newspaper, and then kind of layering it like a lasagna. And also what you can do before this is you can aerate your soil really gently with a pitchfork, just by like punching holes in your soil with a pitchfork and gently lifting, but not completely turning over the soil. And you can add cardboard and do the lasagna layering without having like a contained raised bed too. You can do this just directly on the ground. And then to make sure to add mulch too, so that your beds retain moisture. And also you can just do in-ground growing. You can do the lasagna bed in ground. This one is my garden where I use sort of rows with berms, and I use a drip irrigation method. And then this other garden doesn't have berms. They just have directly into their natural soil with mulch on top.
Okay, so waffle bed gardening is kind of a indigenous type of growing that have been happening in sub-arid regions, but also it's just to create barriers to help collect water during the monsoon season, but also to protect them from the, runoffs, because a lot of these farms were really set in washways or alleyways or ditches or anything like that, something flat, but also something with sandy soil or kind of sandy clay type of soil. So a lot of these ways were practiced heavily back then. But of course, you really have to kind of plan out like where the water is going to be coming from, really structure the whole thing. So of course, there's a lot of digging, there's a lot of handwork involved. But it's been shown successful. And I myself, I mean, not on this type of scale, but a small little plot in my little garden. But I mostly put mine in like a circular type of I guess formation. And I use that for my garden, for my corn, and for my big leaf type of vegetables, which are my corn, my squash, my melons. So I usually use that for them because during the monsoon season, it really does work well in catching the rain that we're getting. And it's just it's amazing because once it's filled up, and then it fills over, and then it goes into like a little puddle, and then that feeds the surrounding layer around it too. So it's just really great type of method. So the garden bed designed by Zuni people as an ecological way to conserve water. High berms deflect high wind. Oh, that's another thing too. It's great for that. Deep basins hold water where it is mostly needed. Which is around like a 6-inch circumference around the base of the plant is where all of the roots are. And if you've ever pulled a lot of these plants, their roots don't really go out as much. They're just kind of there, stuck in one area. So that's where a lot of the water is focused more on. Or if you're adding nutrients into it, that's where you want to focus as well. But if you're looking at, like bigger trees and stuff like that, or shrubs or bushes, you want to broaden that spectrum around the base over time, because if you're just focusing on that little spot, the roots are just going to be kind of in that area and they're not going to expand, which really becomes a problem when they start to grow taller and bigger and the wind comes through. It can easily, push them over. And so that means that there was a properly developed wide enough root system below ground. So that's just for the shrubby type of or woody type of plants. But for your garden plants, a lot of it's just around the base, and they kind of dig down a little bit, but they don't go too far. So that's the way this is meant for. And a lot of it's pretty great. I love it. And especially during the winter too, a lot of those pockets will be filled with snow too, and it'll last a little longer than the flat areas because the flat areas are exposed to the sunlight, and so they're deflected away, and then it melts pretty quick. But for those like little areas where you can see the shadows on the lower left corner of the picture, you'll see those little shadows. Those little shadows really make a big difference, especially in that little area. They hold the water a little more longer. The exposed air to the sun gets dried out, but there's that section to where the water's still there. So it slowly dries out eventually. And then once you dig into the earth, just a few inches, it doesn't matter how deep it is. Well, it kind of matters, but once you go down a few inches, it changes the conditions drastically. It'll be a little bit only warmer in that little like concavement. Water will be more focused around there. The air will kind of pass over, so it's not taking away a lot of the moisture, or it's not taking away a lot of the heat. So it's pretty great. So this it works really well if you were to look at it scientifically. So it's a great method to try, and I encourage you to try it. And of course, it involves a lot of people. So the more people you have, the better, the easier work it has. So that's where, family or involvement, meaning family, is where, or even friends, or family friends kind of thing. So yeah, it's a community type of involvement that makes the work easy.
Yeah, and we had a question. It says, how can we combine our indigenous ways of planting into our modern way of planting? And this is one of the ways. You can definitely use all of these methods. You can use raised beds, you can use in-ground growing with drip irrigation, and then you can use waffle garden beds. You can use all of it. And you can, through trial and error, you'll find out which plants do better where and plan accordingly with each season. So great way to incorporate the indigenous planting methods, and also a great way to adapt to, climate change.
Yeah, and then not only that, but I think once you start into it, you're not gonna be as successful as someone that you had seen before. A first year, I'm saying about first couple years, but eventually you start to develop your own type of way of growing, and that's where it really becomes like a your own farms type of identity, I guess. And so different sections of the different farms are not going to act the same, so that's where you're going to have to start to implement different things. And so that's why I kind of incorporated my garden with the waffle beds, the raised beds, the lasagna, and what do you call it? Kind of a wild area where wild forbs and grasses can grow. So I implemented all that just because there's different little differences between all of them. It's not like a flat surface. It's kind of like a V-shaped type of angle. And so I'm using those different characteristics to involve these different types of methods of planting. And it's been working pretty well. Like, I'm not mad about it. But it does take some time to learn, and it takes some time to develop over time. So just work with it. Work with whatever you know already. And then over time, you'll start to, develop your own questions that you want to know about. And then all of a sudden someone will mention something, and then you'll be like, oh, like, how'd you go about it this way? And then they'll tell you their solution, and you'll try it. And then if it didn't work, then try something else. It's something that's never like concrete. Like when it comes to gardening, it's always going to change. And I think that's the fun thing about gardening in itself. So it's pretty interesting. Okay, and then now we're gonna be going into irrigation methods. So if you're talking about small gardening at home or even on a larger scale, water is one of the most crucial things that you really need to determine how much you have and how long you have it, the distance of it, and the quantity that you can get. Because without that information, you're really going to struggle on how your water sources is going to get to your garden or to your plots or to your fields. So determining that beforehand, before you start planting, will really help you in being successful long run. So you can use a hose or a can for watering. But a lot of times, I think hoses type of growing, watering, I guess, methods is really wasteful in a sense because it's not really focused on the area of interest of below your plants. It's just kind of broad spectrum a lot of the areas. Can watering or the what do you call it? Yeah, can watering is really great because you're focusing on like the one plant itself and below it. And when you're carrying it back and forth, you really want to focus on just that little area. You're not going to be focusing on like a larger area. Drip irrigation is really great. It uses less water, but has a more higher turn back rate as far as like vegetable growth comes. And so that's something that's really great, but it does kind of cost when you start up. Like a lot of the little details in that really start to add up over time. And the one thing about drip irrigation systems, you really have to replace some of the stuff every year because sometimes it gets clogged with sand, or sometimes if your water is hard or there's high mineral content in it, that will start to plug up your holes, and that'll start to plug up the hoses themselves, and that's where you start to get like pressure buildup and stuff like that. So it just throws it off. So that's why it's recommended to really switch them out every year. Recommended on that. Furrow irrigation is just basically flood irrigation type of thing, as you can see on the top with the corn, where you have these little berms, and then in between them, like a lower section, and that's where you do the flooding, and then the water will seep down, but also seep sideways, and then it'll eventually get to the roots of the plant. But that's if you have a lot of water to have access on that, you would do it that way. But if not, I would say drip irrigation and hand watering is the best way to go as far as water consumption goes or usage. And then you have the sprinkler irrigation, which is another type of watering, but unless you're really growing like grass or anything like that, or for forage, I wouldn't recommend sprinklers because it's just a lot of waste of water in my opinion. So drip irrigation and hand watering are the best ways to go, and that just depends on how big of an area you're going to be doing. So I think that really restricts of an area of how much you want to grow and stuff like that. But that's where raised bed gardening and the waffle bed gardening really help in playing that crucial role. But like I said, if you're in an area that gets pretty good amount of rain, you're just gonna be watering for at least a month or 2 to 3 months, and then you're just gonna wait on the rain and they do the rest of it for you. And rainwater is the best water for irrigation no matter what. Yeah.
And I definitely think drip irrigation is the preferred method because when it comes to hand watering, you have to be able to do that every day.
Oh yeah.
And you have to remember to do that every day because if you don't, that could risk losing your plants if you forget one day. So that's why drip irrigation is really easy. I've even seen some people install like an automatic drip irrigation where it drips at a certain time during the day. That's more expensive. What I do is I just set my drip irrigation and I'll like turn it on for like 10 minutes in the evening time. I definitely recommend watering during the morning time or the evening time because this lessens the evaporation rate. So if you were to water like at noontime when the sun is the highest, a lot of that water is going to be evaporated away from your plant. And then for sprinkler irrigation, like Daryl said, this is not recommended. Also because some of your plants do not like to get their leaves wet, or if their leaves do get wet, this can introduce like diseases and like different funguses can grow on them. So just keep that in mind. And yeah.
Yeah, and then to add to that, like I was saying, a lot of the bacteria, or like fungus, if you guys know anything about fungus, they really love moist and warm conditions. So if you're gonna be watering your leafy greens or anything like from the leaf on top, and it gets, beaten by the sun during the day, you're creating that moist, more warm environment. And so whatever spore that had been floating in the air and it gets trapped into those leaf crevices, has that condition to finally start to develop. And so then they'll start to spread. And then that's where you start to get fungus type of involvement. And then sometimes dependent on the plant or the type of fungus that's growing, it'll either kill your plant or it'll kind of take over it to where it can't grow anymore. So it's just, yeah. So you just don't want to be watering from the top. Even if the plants had drooped down, you still want to water the base because a lot of the water uptake will happen from the roots and then upward. So try to restrict the amount of water that you put on the leaves because, like I said, you're just creating that environment for something to happen. And that's also an area for aphids or other type of insects that will kind of hide out in because it's warmer there and it's more moisture. Um, so yeah, so ground watering is the best way. Okay, dryland farming, completely dependent on precipitation. Now, dryland farming is a whole different type of method in itself. And you really have to get seeds that have been dryland farmed for more than a decade, because if you get something that really loves water and you put it into this area of dryland farming, it will not do well whatsoever. Because just think about it, if you got a source of a seed that came from a farm that had been irrigating it almost like 12 hours a day, and it gets sunlight like crazy and it gets water like crazy, and you get that seed has a memory of an air of what it went through just the last year. And it'll be like, oh, like I have all this water access, I have all this heat access. Now that's great. So it's going to be expecting that. And then when you plant it here, it's going to be wanting that. So and that's not going to happen. And so it's not going to develop as nicely, or it's not going to develop as big, and it's just going to be this little stubby little thing. So making sure if you're going to be going with dryland farming, that it's going to be something that has been dryland farmed prior to being planted. And then if you notice here, there's not a whole lot of rows. It's just mostly flat. And the spacing between each plant is about 6 to 8 feet apart. And that just really helps in maintaining the amount of moisture that had fallen or was fallen onto. And then the roots have access to that water. And that's where maintaining a lot of the weeds in between is going to be really crucial. And then you're just going to have to be out there every day. And dryland farming is, you're not going to be watering anything at all. And you're just going to be reliant on the precipitation that comes from the snow melting in the spring and the monsoon rains at the end of the summer. Well, dependent on where you're located. So that's how dryland farming really is different from modernized or more water inclusive type of farming.
I definitely think this is a lot of, I don't know if you know anything, if anyone knows anything about permaculturists, but this is sort of like a goal for a lot of farmers that are using permaculture methods, is to depend on the precipitation that naturally comes from the sky. So this is also a traditional method. A lot of the Hopi people and the Net people and even Pueblo people use these methods, and they have seeds that have been dryland farmed for decades. So the seeds are well adapted to dryland farming. And it's also very dependent on, prayer. A lot of the times, the Ned people and Hopi people, they pray over their cornfields, they pray over their plants, and they pray for rain, and they give offerings for these things. So
Yeah, and then also aside from that, if you notice the picture on the right, there's a lot of corn growing in one spot. And if you're looking at conventional type of growing for corn, you're just gonna have to like choose 1 to 2 stalks and growing in that little spot. But for here, it's gonna be 4 to 5 or even more. And that's because the plant itself will only grow about 3 to 4 feet tall. Um, and then it'll only throw out 1 ear of good corn, and then the rest of it will really be baby. So each one of those stalks will only have one full ear. And that's not I guess related to conventional type of growing. Corn usually kicks out around 3 to 6 type of or ears on each stalk, but for this one, it's just going to be one per stalk, and that's where clump growing is really, I guess, popular for dryland farming. And that's just like the different points of like growing in general, how dryland farming is really different from that. And so a lot of the ideas that we have beforehand of growing is really changed when it comes to dryland farming. And it just really depends on your knowledge about the land and not your knowledge about the seed, but also the knowledge about the weather conditions in your area. So you just have to really know all that beforehand. And then that's when you can finally decide to dryland farm. From my experience from the past 2 years, some Hopi families haven't even grown corn because they said that based on the plants that they've seen during the springtime of the spring, spring plants that come out, if there's some that don't come out, they determine that year to be a drought year just based on the plants itself. So that's something that I want to eventually get to know. Um, and then last year's monsoon season, one of the plants had finally come out again that they use in the traditional cooking practices and their seasonings. And it's something I never heard of, and I finally found out about it last fall. So it's something that's pretty great. So a lot of the plants that we have in our regions really do tell the future of like, what we'll be experiencing in the long run. So I think that's something that's pretty great. That's something that I aim for personally. So I was I was pretty fortunate to learn about that.
Yeah, so this is definitely a goal for me as well. I have some dryland farming seeds that I'm gonna try out this year for the first time. So it's gonna be a lot of prayer and just like hoping that the rains do come this year. Because like Daryl said, the past 2 years we've seen a very little monsoon season, if any at all. So remaining hopeful. And just some additional tips that we can give you. Be prepared for failure. Me and Daryl and basically any grower that you probably know knows that there is a lot of failure involved. You'll plant your plants and they'll be thriving one day, and then you'll go out there and they'll all be gone because prairie dogs came or rabbits came and took out your whole field. Or you had a late frost or an early frost that took out your plants. So I don't know, I always prepare myself to, not be too disappointed when things don't go right. And also expect a lot of labor and groundwork. This is also a great time to get your friends together, to get your comrades, your family, your community to come out and help you with a lot of the groundwork and a lot of the work that it takes to maintain a field and maintain a garden. Also have a goal in mind, have a goal for your season and make an outline to achieve that goal. It's always it's also intertwined with the indigenous model of, having these steps that you take, in Sagkes, you think about it first, not you plant it and then you live it out. You plant your seeds and then, Sihasin, your harvest comes, and then you reflect on that year and what you can do again for next year.
Yeah, and then back to what Jaden was saying, that always, don't plan for it, but just expect it. That it's not going to go the way that you had wanted to. But that just goes back into like, your learning process. Because if that didn't happen, how would you have known that it was going to happen eventually, kind of thing. And then also another practice that I've recently been, told about was also to plant twice. Basically, in a sense, I guess indigenously, that you're not only planting for yourself, but you're planting for the beings around you. So you're gonna have a little section on the barrier of your garden as a sacrifice, known as a sacrifice plot. And that's where a lot of the aphids, a lot of the maybe the birds, or even the prairie dogs or squirrels or chipmunks or rabbits will be able to have access to, but they're not gonna, affect your most precious part of the plot. So that's also something that I've heard about. And you, like I said, you're gonna be planting pretty well, not just for yourself, but for your family and the beings around you. So that's something to keep in mind. And yeah, and then look into the different types of beneficial flowers, herbs, and shrubs that can be incorporated into your garden, because a lot of plants really do help in deterring or reflecting or absorbing the badness of some type of insects that can affect your larger crops that you hold precious. So yeah, so look into those as well. I think it'll be pretty great in the long run.
One thing that I forgot to add to the presentation is seed saving. So this could be an entire workshop in itself, but after you have your harvest, it's a good idea to save your seeds, and even to leave some plants alone so that they go into their natural seeding stage. And then you gather these seeds and you keep them for the next year. It's also a great way to practice your food security, and also practice the communal food sharing, seed sharing. So you can give these seeds out to your community, to your family. And so, yeah, you can raise everybody's food security around you.
Yeah, and then just making sure that you're properly seed saving a lot of these seeds, and just looking into the different ways of collecting. Some of them aren't as easy as others. Corn is pretty easy. You just have to wait for it to dry out. Plants like kale, lettuce, and your beets and stuff like that, they do have to overwinter, meaning they have to stay into the ground until the spring comes around when it starts to warm up, and then they'll send out a long stalk that'll have the flowers develop on there. And then after they get pollinated by the local pollinators or by wind, then they'll go into their seeds creations. And then each plant will have different types of seeds, and it's just amazing. Aside from collecting the fruits and vegetables from the plant, their seeds in itself are structures are pretty unique. So even that experience is pretty awesome to see. So just determine on those two to see what needs to overwinter. Some of them go through it pretty fast. Sometimes if you have really strong climatic fluctuations that are happening, your plant will also be like, okay, it's cold enough, or like this is too much for me to handle. The only thing I can do now is just put up my flowers and go into the seed stage. So that sometimes happens too. So sometimes you get early flowering and early seeding happening too. And that's just all determinant on the plant respondents to its climatic conditions, which is nothing that has to do with you or anything around it. It's just something that happens naturally.
Yeah, so that concludes our presentation. I think we can, oh wait, we have one more slide. These are some resources that we have. Again, if you joined late, this presentation will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel, Uplift Climate YouTube channel. And so yeah, here's some seed resources. We have nativeseeds.org, rareseeds.com, nativeplanandseed.com, westernnativseed.com, southwestseed.com, and seedsource.com. And like Daryl said, one of the best ways you can get seeds that are adapted to your local climate is to look to local farms and also farmers markets for your seeds. That'll ensure that you have the best seed available for your condition, your area locally.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we can open it up to a discussion or any questions, or if anybody has additional tips that they want to give about their growing or gardening,
Mhm.
or just any questions at all. Go ahead, Logan. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, one of my experience for planting is that water bottles when you're growing your seedlings really help because it keeps all the moisture in.
Oh, that's another thing too. Just determine what type of seeds do well in transplanting, or which one need to be directly transplanted in or directly planted into the ground. For an example, some types of grasses or some types of flowers or even some corn need to be directly planted into the ground, and they have to be at a certain depth for them to be successful. Others do well being transplanted from a seed starter tray, like your leafy greens. I've even done it with squash. Let me see what else is there. But some of them really need to have a direct ground seeding to happen for proper germination. But that was a good one though.
Chad Sosi, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, so my brother actually planted and I have helped him too with some, but some where we live, it's like high elevation. So some plants they don't grow, some of them do, but I've noticed that tomatoes actually grow pretty well up in like high elevations, and also maybe a little bit of corn. They grow good, I guess, but not really that much. But if you were like to plant in high elevation, you should like use the type like you were explaining in the presentation, use like the type of vegetables and seeds, the ones that actually grow in your climate. So, but yeah, that's what.
Awesome. No, that's good. Especially for corn. Corn is a whole that can be a whole presentation in itself. But there are some high elevation types of adapted corn, and there's some that are in lower, some are in mid regions. So I think that's one question that you can ask when you're seed sourcing is what elevation did you grow these in? Because if they're same or similar to your area, then they will do pretty well. But if not, then there's going to be a dramatic difference in the leaf foliage or in the formation of the plant, or they won't grow at all. So it's just really tricky. So making sure that elevation is a factor that you ask when you're seed sourcing.
Somebody said, what's the best material to use if you want to make a greenhouse from scratch? I know that there are farms that use hoop houses. So this isn't necessarily a greenhouse, but it is like a protected area that's pretty cheap. You can make it with, I think they use spacing out.
So for that one, and for the arches, I guess the ribs is what they call it. They use PVC piping. Some of them use like a galvanized type of steel that you can bend really easily. 2x4s, 4x8s, not 4x8, 2x8s hold the foundation of the structure. If you're looking into, I don't know, it just depends on the size of it. You can really get creative with them. I can't really say what the best sources are. That just really depends on how big you want it and what your local lumber or local hardware store sells for their prices and everything like that. That's something that I'm working on myself. So yeah, you just have to really get creative with it. And then it just comes to self preferences and stuff like that too.
I know that there is also a method of making a really inexpensive greenhouse by using cattle panels.
Mm,
So you can use the cattle panels and have like some lumber at the base, and you basically nail one side and you make an arch and you nail the other side, and then you cover it with a plastic. And this is usually a short term, probably not very long. So you wouldn't have it for too long, because especially if you live in an area with high wind, the plastic that you use, that's like the thinner sheet plastic, that can tear pretty easily in high winds. So if you just need it for like a few seasons, you can make a very inexpensive greenhouse using the sheet plastic and the cattle panels with like some lumber. And I know there's some YouTube videos too, and like you could probably make a Google search on that. Are there any other comments or questions for us? Mehedo Ikiahet also. Thank you everyone for coming.
Oh, yeah. And I hope everyone has a successful gardening, big or small. So let's manifest that.
Yes, manifesting a good raining season for this year and a good growing season. And that all of our plants thrive in abundance. The YouTube link, we'll probably post this probably next week, and we'll post that on our Instagram channel. Oh, Lyrica posted the YouTube link in the chat. And you can also contact me or Daryl if you have any additional questions. I'll put my email in the chat.
Can't see my keyboard. Can you put mine too?
Yeah. See. I forgot. What is yours, Daryl?
DYAZZIEJR@dennacollege.edu.
All right, and I put that in the chat as well. So feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or anything you want to know.
Awesome. Well, thank you for Uplift for inviting me and Jaden. And thank you for creating the space. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jaden and Daryl. Cool. Should we end the Zoom?
Yeah, let's end.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you.